How do you feel when songs or bands you love appear in comedies, like films or TV shows, sketches? The most famous one that comes to mind to me is the scene in Wayne's World where they're riding in the car and they're listening to Bohemian Rhapsody and they're going like this the whole way, or Austin Powers where Burt Bacharach is playing piano. Like I think it's on a stretch, like some sort of stretch limo vehicle that's like open top, while Mike Myers is on a date. Right there, and he like turns, and then there's Burt Bacharach playing piano, or you hear it first, and the camera turns, and he's like right there, which is pretty funny. Or the ultimate, the example with the More Cowbell skit from SNL with Blue Oyster Cult's "Don't Fear the Reaper," or Cannibal Corpse in Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. And what does that have to do with what I'm talking about today, which is this new reissue of Black Sabbath's 1982 double live album Live Evil, and this new-ish book, Ronnie James Dio's autobiography Rainbow in the Dark from 2021, and the Dio biopic Dreamers Never Die from last year. Just to set the stage here, I want to talk about all those things and Dio's entire, or do an overview of his whole musical career, which is really, really impressive in its sprawl and the different stages of it and where he started compared to where he ended up, all the different twists and turns. I mean, you hear old recordings of him from the early 60s or see pictures and it's like, wow, like that's the same guy. It's quite amazing. And obviously the book and the film cover that. And this new reissue is a pivotal marker in that entire story. Okay. So Black Sabbath is not only one of my favorite bands, one of my favorite things in life. I am more partial to the classic original lineup with Ozzy Osbourne fronting the band than I am to the Ronnie James Dio fronted period of the band. However, there's some stuff from that period that I really love, and that was my actual introduction to the band because the version of the song Mob Rules was in the animated film Heavy Metal. And the soundtrack to Heavy Metal is one of my favorite albums of all time. When I got that out cassette for Christmas 1982, I pressed play, and I had seen the film on HBO several times up until that point, which is why I asked for the soundtrack. But when I pressed play and I heard the first power chords from the Sammy Hagar tune that starts that album off, it was like I had the same feeling that a recovering alcoholic once described to me about what he felt the first time he ever touched alcohol or drank alcohol, tasted alcohol, which was that there was he discovered something that he had always thought was outside of himself or he had never even known of. So of course it was outside, but then he realized it had always been in him somehow. And so my taste for rock music that moment, it was as if it had always been there, which was a really profound experience. So I have a real soft spot for Mob Rules, the song, and for the album, because that's the first tape I went out and got in the cover for me at the time. That Giger cover of those hooded, faceless figures I found it really evil looking. Of course, couldn't resist getting it, right? So I actually love that record. There's a song on that album called Sign of the Southern Cross, which when I was 12 years old, I took literally with the only reference points that I knew of. I didn't know that the Southern Cross is a constellation in the sky. And so I thought, wow, this is about burning cross. This is like their critique of the KKK. And the song is really, really eerie and heavy, ominous sounding, beautiful also. Just an intense, I mean, I even get the chills just thinking about it. Very, very intense. And so to my 12-year-old mind, the scariest thing I could think of was the image of crosses in flame on people's lawns and how scary and horrible what I thought the band was sort of painting a picture of like the capacity for human evil. So that's always what the mental image I come back to. And I'm laughing not because that's funny, but because, well, it is funny for a kid to immediately go there, but because it's so literal and that's not what the song is at all, but it still works for me on that level. And I bring that up because there are moments on that album that are really, 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 really powerful. But I have mixed feelings about that period. The era that Dio came in, which was right as Ozzy was leaving. I mean, the last album they did with Ozzy was 1978's Never Say Die, which is one of my favorites. It has like a dizzying range of styles that they cover. They go into like jazz fusion. There's what I would describe, it's not even a piano ballad. It's, I don't even know what to call it. It's sort of new agey almost. Not quite. It's a piano featuring tune that's like one of my favorite songs by them that just really, I get carried away listening to it. So initially, Tony Iommi, Sabbath's guitarist and sort of anchor, along with bassist Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi approached Ronnie James Dio, who had just left Rainbow. Maybe it had been like a year or something that he left Rainbow. Actually, that's not right. But he had recently left Rainbow, and it's all in the book, and I have all my dates sort of sloshing around in my head. But he approached Ronnie initially to do a solo project outside of Sabbath because they were going to try to do the follow-up to Never Say Die with Ozzy. He started working with Ronnie, then he brought Ronnie in with the rest of the band eventually, and it just clicked, and they decided to go, oh, no, this is the new Sabbath. This is clicking too well. Things had gotten really, really difficult with Ozzy at that point. You know, there's that famous / infamous last run that they did with Van Halen opening for them, which, I mean, is sort of like a change, symbolic changing of the guard with Van Halen just completely, tearing a face like a gigantic, it's like a nuclear detonation going off, in the face of music, and Sabbath being this other older thing. So a couple things happened when they brought Ronnie in. They started to sound more contemporary. They got heavier. They were more in line with early 80s, what was becoming metal, that style, 80s style metal. It's heavier, it's thicker, it's denser. But I felt, and this is not through any fault of Ronnie's, even though they were saying, oh, wow, we got this guy that we could do anything with. We felt we could do anything. He's got so much range. He's actually technically, he's a trained musician because he started on trumpet at age 5, which is important to know. In spite of all that, I feel that they regressed and got more limited than they ever had been. The sound on these two records is kind of, it's not exactly uniform, but it's in mostly one lane, which to me feels like a step backwards. And I've always, I was going to say, I've always been partial to the Ozzy era. That to me is sort of the real quote unquote Sabbath. This to me felt like kind of a detour and a blip, and it was too short-lived for them to really have a comparable body of work. We're talking about 2 albums really in this time frame. versus 8. You can't really, that doesn't really balance out for me. The last song on Mob Rules, I've always just been sort of confounded by. I find it to be like this, like sort of endlessly plodding kind of the song just doesn't do anything for me at all. So that always kind of, for me, that album didn't end strong for me on this like really amazing note that cemented its place for me the way the classic era records or the Ozzy era records did. However, if you're listening to this and you hear me say that and you happen to love that song or you think that album is the greatest ever, amen to that. I am happy. I would be, and I mean this, I would be thrilled if there were like millions of people out there that were like, no, dude, that song is incredible. What are you talking about? That's like one of my favorites ever. What, like this guy is, totally off the mark. That's what I want. Because then it would show me that the band's instincts in doing that song and in closing the record with that song were right. And it just happened to go over me and not connect with me. But I would be happy if everybody in the world except me loved that song. And I'm like, all right, cool. Because then that record is that thing for those people. And I can appreciate that instead of like just being sort of in my own head, like, it's not the flavor I like. So as much as I liked or even loved Mob Rules, a friend of mine, an older guy in my neighborhood named Danny in the Bronx, on my block from the building next door, he had a tape of Live at Last and he didn't like it. Live at Last wasn't released until 1980. It was a live release not sanctioned by the band that was released by a record label that had the rights to some of their stuff, and the band had to like sue them to get it. It was never actually officially even released in the US in that form. My friend was like, I'll trade you the one you have for this one because I don't like this one. He said, it sounds like cemetery music. I fell in love with that on such a profound level. The band actually in these new liner notes for this reissue complains about how awful it sounds. They think the mix is terrible. I couldn't disagree more. It is a little muddy and distant sounding, but boy, oh boy, is it powerful. So those were the first versions I heard of songs like Sweet Leaf, Tomorrow Never, Tomorrow's Dream. I was going to say Tomorrow Never Knows. Tomorrow's Dream. Sweet Leaf, Tomorrow's Dream, Killing Myself to Live, the Cornucopia, and they just sounded so like the tone, just like I just got so pulled into that. That was recorded in 1973 before Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, which is actually my favorite Sabbath album. And so that to me is the definitive Sabbath live album. Now those same performances and even more from that show has been released twice now in different forms. It was released in the Past Lives recently, like there's a set called Past Lives, but it's got a different mix. And then it was released in the Sabbath, it's the Volume 4 Super Deluxe, which comes in a box just like this one, multi-disc set. But that's a different mix as well. It's cleaner. So it's like their idea of like improving it, but to me, nothing will compete with just the like, there's these like feedback squalls in between every song that are just that's where I fell in love with this band and have been ever since. So much so that I really can't even be in the same room as people talking about them. That's how profound my attachment is. That I feel like people tend to glom onto the surface aspects and talk about them in a really kind of crude way, and I just have to leave. I can't even listen to it. So again, mixed feelings about this period, but I've always wanted to love this live album because the artwork is so stunning. I mean, I wish, I don't know why they didn't issue a poster of the cover, because it is like has to be in the running for one of the greatest album covers ever. It's just beautiful and so fitting for what you want this album to be, which is pulled into the deep nether trenches of a Black Sabbath live experience. I have felt over the years that the album doesn't quite live up to, it certainly doesn't live up to the cover. For me, it is flawed, but there's a lot to really love as well for me. And while I am partial to the original, well, I'm partial to the remastered versions of the original mix. I haven't ABC'd the 3 different remasters of that mix. I know that the remasters have additional in-between stuff in between the songs. So some stage banter. There's an introduction, like a Tony Iommi noodling on guitar, which I actually think adds a lot because it's sort of in a classical style. Before one of the heavier tunes. And that's still there on this remaster. And then there's this new mix, which is clearer, heavier, but there's things about it that don't quite connect for me. The story with this album is that mixing this live album actually broke this lineup apart. They asked Dio to leave because Tony and Geezer were mixing things at nighttime, and Ronnie James Dio and then drummer Vinny Appice were coming in the daytime, and they felt that Ronnie was taking over the process. And so kind of passive aggressively, according to Ronnie in the book, we're like, well, we kind of want Tony to take over here. And the original mix has a lot of issues. Like the crowd sounds like it's not there, basically. They kind of like gave keyboard player Jeff Nichols short shrift. It was one of those cases where they have the keyboard player like hidden from the crowd, which is obnoxious, I think, and unnecessary. I hate it when bands do that. It's just so like overly image conscious, and just it's not like you're not hearing the keyboards. So there's that. There's also the fact that they were playing a very predictable suite. Not a suite. It wasn't like they like mixed it into a medley or anything, but they're playing a very predictable set of their earlier classics, almost like a greatest hits, which I think, why would you do that? And I just, for the most part, I feel very resistant to Dio singing Ozzy's material, not on principle, but there's something about it that just doesn't gel for me, except towards the end of this record, it starts to win me over. I think that the record always showed drummer Vinny Appice. It always almost featured him. Like I had always thought of him as a way more kind of ham-fisted drummer than Bill Ward. Way too direct. Not enough subtlety. Not enough of the intangibles that made Bill Ward one of my favorite drummers ever. But I really, really like how both of these mixes actually showcase him. Just the timbre of his drums, it just sits very nicely within everything, and it's not only powerful, but it's you can really hear the tone of his and almost the way they're tuned as well, which I really, really like. I have never been in love with the way Dio interacts with the crowd on this record. It just doesn't quite connect with me. So there's that. Let me think of what else. The new mix, again, it's more clear. It's more sort of ferocious sounding. The crowd is louder, but where the old mix had the guitar and the bass just panned up the middle, the new mix then pans the guitar and the bass, and so the bass still really isn't much more present, and so it's like this empty space on one side of the stereo field, which I think was a big mistake. It wasn't really necessary to do it that way. They could have just left it almost in mono, except for the drums, and it would have sounded really, really cool. They could have reined things in. Not technically mono, but And they could have had a little bit of a spread, but it didn't need to be this wide. I thought that was an overcompensation, and I don't understand from a mixing perspective why you would do that. However, with all that said, the stuff from the 2 records that Ronnie had done with them up until that point is like, I mean, it's if you like those records, this is worth checking out. I should also say that on Live Evil, they do something really interesting in that rendition of Sign of the Southern Cross, which I'm not going to give away if you haven't heard the record. But it's like, if you went to the show, you'd be like, oh man, that was cool. That was like not what I was expecting, but what I kind of would have wanted. So that's definitely something to check out on this album. Again, I don't know for the price point whether you will find all of this worth it. You might just want to get an old used vinyl copy of one of the original pressings because the artwork is actually a little bit brighter. Anyway, it looks like they maybe didn't have the original or something, and they had to do some sort of reproduction because it's flatter also, in terms of the color palette. It doesn't look like it has less dimension, but it's not glossy the way the old one was. So, you might be fine with that. You might be fine with one of the remasters. There's 2 now on Spotify because there's the 2008 one and then there's this one. So you might be fine with that, but I would suggest giving this album a chance and sitting with it and letting it sort of work its magic on you over time or over the experience of listening to the whole show. And you might find, like me, that you're in more of a receptive place to it. It's unfortunate that this lineup broke apart in the mixing. That just seems, and even the way they've talked about it ever since. I mean, I know Geezer Butler in 1990, when this lineup got back together, said we were acting like children then, and it certainly sounds like it. But in subsequent years, there's a quote from Geezer in Dreamers Never Die, where he's like, I don't know what happened, and then there's quotes in this that sort of contradict that, where they kind of double down a little bit on letting Dio go, and I don't know. Those quotes, some of them I'm sure have been floating around out there for a while. It's a little unclear which ones are new versus not. So it's like, it's sort of the ultimate, like, can't you guys get in a room and talk this out? And even Tony Iommi says in these new liner notes, yeah, for some reason we couldn't talk about it. We couldn't talk this through. But they kind of doubled down and they really shot themselves in the foot. They kind of like killed their career at that point, actually. If you really think about what happened here, and I really like that they went with Ian Gillan, Deep Purple singer, from their most famous lineup, Mach 2 lineup of Deep Purple, for one record, but that only lasted one record. It didn't sell well. The tour didn't do well, whereas these 2 albums and these tours did very, very well. And for them not to have the perspective that, man, that was a career killer for them. Sabbath soon thereafter just spiraled into complete, utter disarray with record after record after record with all these different people and then all these reunions. And so they got back together with Ronnie for 1990's Dehumanizer, Ronnie and Vinny. Then that only lasted one record. Then eventually in the 2000s, they got back together with him again, and they rebranded it as Heaven and Hell so as not to confuse people, because there were intermittent Ozzy reunion tours going on at that point. And then in 2010, he passed away. There were plans to do more, but he passed away. It was nice to see that phase of their career kind of go out on a high note, even though the obviously he got cancer and that pulled the plug on that, and that felt premature as well, but they were on top and people were in demand, and there was a lot of respect around the record they did called The Devil You Know. And I've seen live footage. It's quite strong in my book. So, But that's that part of the story. And I'm glad he reconciled with it, and they all reconciled with it, because there's definitely unfinished business. And when you hear this live album and hear how powerful that band could be in its prime, it's like, why would you do that? Why would you? First of all, why wouldn't you just hire a mixing engineer? I mean, they had one, they had an engineer, but not somebody who like took over. That's a mixing engineer's job, is to say, okay, band people, back off. I'm going to mix this. Then I'm going to present this to you and get your feedback. And I might override you on that, because there's that old axiom. This is why bands don't mix records, because they're too biased towards their own instruments to be impartial enough to do what's actually fitting. However, I don't think the mix they did was a disaster, and I don't think the new mix corrects for necessarily whatever was deficient in the old mix. So there's that. I had always had a suspicion that my preference for Dio and his voice, which I love his voice. I don't always jive with his lyrics, his sort of sword and sorcery imagery. I don't always jive with his phrasing, but I love his voice. You know, they describe him in the documentary as, or I think Eddie Trunk, the famous radio host, and who also worked at Megaforce Records for a while when John Zazula got Megaforce Records off the ground in the early 80s. He describes him, I believe, in the film as the most powerful voice in metal. I wouldn't go that far, but it is a powerful voice. And, you know, everybody jokes in the film about, wow, such a slight-framed person, how such a person with a slight frame could have such a booming voice. I personally feel, to borrow a phrase from drummer Bill Bruford, who wrote in his book that his spiritual home was in King Crimson. Of all the projects he ever did, that's where he felt he was the most at home. I personally always had a hunch that Ronnie James Dio was most in his element in Rainbow, the band that Richie Blackmore started around him and his previous band, Elf. I went back and listened to some Rainbow, and just as I suspected, the three records he did with Rainbow, Richie Blackmore's Rainbow, Rainbow Rising, and Long Live Rock and Roll, that's where I most connect. I'm just like, man, this is for me where this guy belonged. And I just loved everything I heard. And I loved his imagery in that context too. I liked it in Sabbath, and I like how he, I like where he met them sort of halfway, because stuff like Mob Rules and Voodoo and Sign of the Southern Cross, to me, bring him a little bit out of that fantasy realm, and it feels more sort of hard-hitting, and it feels more sort of street level and about real life. And he was always singing about real life. All that stuff was supposed to be metaphorical. He explains that in the book. But that was his sort of poetic vehicle into grabbing his audience on an emotional level and letting that be the transporter for wherever they ended up with his lyrics. So there's also the band Elf right before Rainbow, which the first Rainbow album is effectively Elf minus the guitar player, which is all covered in the book, in really great detail too. I really appreciated how he's telling that story step by step, and then Richie Blackmore starts picking people off one by one. But Elf was picking up that really British blues-based hard rock tradition that had just started to take root in the late 60s, and they were all in it. I mean, they were like full on. Because when you look at the pictures of Ronnie in the early 60s I mean, he was going around to the Brill building and looking for songs, just to put it in perspective, looking for songs to cover. He had this clean cut sort of Donovan, sort of Gene Vincent looking image, short hair. And then it kept changing the name of the band. It was like the Prophets, then Ronnie and the Prophets, then Ronnie and the Elves. There's like 10 different band names in this stretch of in that stretch of time. Ronnie and the Elves, and then finally Elf, which is their own acknowledgement of their height, because they were all around the same height. And people would joke, even their friends, that they were like midgets. In Dreamers Never Die, Roger Glover talks about and then all these midgets came in the room, and suddenly they like blew us away with their sound, which is real heavy, swampy, grooving, British style, but very sort of American, gritty, heavy rock. And through various machinations, they had a manager that was also booking, I believe, Deep Purple. It's in the book. It's in Ronnie's book. And so they did a showcase for Clive Davis at the CBS Records offices in Manhattan. And Deep Purple bassist Roger Glover and drummer Ian Pace wanted to be producers, and Deep Purple had a label. This is when Ritchie Blackmore was still in the band. And so they showcased for Davis, who's like one of the biggest music industry figures ever, and for Glover and Pace. And that ended up with Roger Glover producing the first Elf, and then eventually Ritchie Blackmore left Deep Purple and came into the picture. And he and Ronnie were really simpatico. They wanted to do something with this British style hard rock, but with a real classical element to it. And that's where they connected. And I feel like that body of work is, to me, almost unassailable. And I think it's, depends what your preferences are, obviously, and where you want to start. Because you can start from the very, very beginning. You can start with Elf. You can start with Rainbow. You can start with Sabbath. Or you can start with Dio, the band that Ronnie formed on leaving Black Sabbath, because when he joined, or when he signed the contract as a member of Sabbath with Warner Brothers, there was also a solo deal wrapped up in that contract. So he just, Vinny Appice went with him, and they formed Dio, and the first couple records were very, very successful. And then you have this new uprising of hair metal, and Ronnie and his wife and manager, Wendy Dio, living in LA at the time, and being sort of at the epicenter and being like almost parental figures to all these other bands like Dokken and, the Motley Crues and people like that. And Dio's music wasn't exactly that, but it certainly was in line with the paradigm of hard rock at the time. The haircuts, the production style, all that stuff. It's not like it was incompatible in the slightest. It's like hair metal adjacent, if you want to say that. And in some ways it is hair metal in some ways, but I know fans might nitpick there. By all accounts, he was a very nurturing presence, and even listening to him on record, he has a kind of parental presence, which I really appreciate. And one thing I really, really, really appreciate about this book, which I loved, I thought it was so enjoyable, is you really get a feel for the person. Like, I never really stopped to think about him much as a person, because I didn't, certain aspects of his presentation musically didn't 100% agree with me, although I've always loved his voice. I really felt like I got to know this guy, even though it's in his own words. And he wrote all the book on handwritten. He wrote it by hand. And then Mick Wall, former Black Sabbath publicist, founder of Classic Rock Magazine, longtime Kerrang contributor in the early 80s, or in the mid 80s. He edited and assembled it into a manuscript, and then Wendy added her notes, and it actually sat for like almost 10 years. She said she couldn't bring herself to release it right away. She explains at the beginning, which I wonder what the demand would have been, because the demand was there right after he died. I wonder, whether it would have sold more right away. Had they released it right when he died and people were like still kind of his audience was grieving or reacting to that, missing him and talking about his career. But it lines up nicely. The book was out in 2021. The documentary was out in last year. And now we have this reissue. And we also had Rhino reissues of the two Sabbath albums he did, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, although I think they kind of botched that. They didn't do multi-disc set or 4 CD sets. They didn't do 4 CD sets. They didn't include complete live shows, which I think was a huge mistake. Probably in anticipation of this eventually being reissued, so they didn't want to kind of like saturate people's appetites. So I really, really appreciated this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It initially didn't spark my attention right away. I thought the writing was a little wooden on like the first 2 pages, and I put it down, and then I picked it back up and it was fine. I feel like Mick Wall, being a magazine publisher, I don't understand why he didn't quite button up the edits a little bit more. I felt like that kind of did a disservice to Ronnie and to the subject and to the book itself, but it didn't. That's nitpicking. It didn't take away. It's only because it made me think of it as more of an amateurish effort than it was. It wasn't. It's not an amateur release, right? It wasn't done in an amateurish way, but there are times when it's not quite. The precision isn't there with the editing, but it doesn't take away at all from the stories, some of which are laugh out loud funny. And I have a soft spot for his whole origins because he's from Cortland. He was raised in Cortland. He was born nearby, but he was raised in Cortland, which is outside of Syracuse, which is in central New York. I live in western New York. I don't live very far from there. And his references to like the landscape and the seasons, I got the sense he was really appreciative of that and really aware of it and really kind of a romantic. And his awareness of like, even like the Native American names for the towns and the woods and stuff like that, and the natural features of that region, that was a nice touch. It was nice to connect with that part of his background. Also, the era that he was coming up in, I've been told by my old boss who replaced the person in the band Head East who wrote their famous hit, which it's called Never Been Any Reason. And I always get confused because the chorus says, "Save my soul, I'm going down for the last time." So I worked once at a pivotal turning point in my life for Tony, who now is, runs a recording studio and manages artists. But he started as a teenager. He played guitar and he replaced the guitarist who wrote that song in Head East. And he told me that in the 70s, you could make a good living as just a regional band playing 6 nights a week, sometimes multiple shows a day. And you'd make a really good living doing that. And it's just like, man, even when he told me that in the early 2000s, the ecosystem had completely changed, and now it's even changed even more since then. So that's cool to go back to that time, because these guys, Ronnie was really pushing and pushing and pushing. Now, he wasn't satisfied being just a regional band, but I felt there was a real charm to that part of the story. So the book, 2 thumbs up from me. The movie, I almost hated, but for the interviews, which were very, very, enjoyable, enlightening, totally worth it. The shots, this film is beautifully shot, and the editing, I thought it was edited excellently well. But filmmakers Don Argett and Demian Fenton, the same team that brought us Last Days Here, which is which is the documentary about Brian Liebling from Pentagram. Let me make sure I got that right. Bobby Liebling. The same filmmaking team that brought us Last Days Here, the documentary about Bobby Liebling from Pentagram, and other films like Believer. I wish they hadn't presented the same tired, cliched device of talking about heavy metal as if it's like a refuge for people who don't belong, and we're all one giant, worldwide community who rallies behind metal, and all of those ridiculous cliches that just do nothing for me, and I can't stand them. And then there's Jack Black, hamming it up in the film, and in a way cheapening the subject. I understand why people, if you loved something when you were a teenager and you've obviously gone on to your adult life and you want to keep the shine there, but it's like you feel like your own adolescent self, everything about you, it's like looking at old haircuts, you feel that's kind of silly, so you want to kind of exist with that version of yourself but kind of laugh at it at the same time. So you kind of laugh at the things that you loved a little bit. I understand sort of the temptation to do that, but I don't, for the life of me, understand why people need to talk about the music they love through the lens of turning it into shtick or a joke. Now, this sounds like I have no sense of humor. This sounds like I don't understand humor. This might even sound like I'm on the spectrum or something, because it's like, oh, got to keep music and humor separate. I know I sound like that, but I don't get why figures like Jack Black do this, or like in the film I Love You Man, where they're playing Tom Sawyer. It's like, give me a break. I don't love you, man. I don't love you, man. If you like Tom Sawyer just because I love Tom Sawyer, we don't necessarily relate just because of that. We might relate. We might strike up an awesome conversation about loving the same things, or we might not, because we might love the same things in completely different ways. On top of that, I don't need you to love the same things as me for me to be interested in you, and certainly not for me to be friends with you or close with you as a person. You don't need to love Rush or Black Sabbath or any of the things I love, or any of the books or the films, anything. I just need to be able to relate to the way you love what you love, or be excited by you loving whatever that is. So this idea that filmmakers have that they just want to throw songs that mean something to them out at us, it's no different than doing a mixtape or a playlist, right? If you're making a film, and I Love You Man looks funny. It looks like it's a fun movie. But if you're making a film and you're just throwing a bunch of songs you like at us, it's like you're coming from this real adolescent place of seeking people because they like the same things as you, seeking to cluster and commiserate with people. Like, yeah, we're all wearing the same uniform, which is a really superficial thing to do. Making fun of the music the same way you make fun of the haircuts and the look and the fashion, those to me are two different things, right? So either you love something or you love it with some reservation that you have to almost do a satire of it. And Jack Black, to me, walks that line all the time. He was in the Rush movie too, and he's like, and he offered some insights, but it's like the shtick, the act, he doesn't have an off switch. I don't want your comedy routine. I don't want you pimping music to support your comedy. And I know that sounds really, really, really uptight. It's not that they can't work together, right? I love it when Cannibal Corpse is in Ace Ventura. I think that was a genius and really, really important. And it charms me, that happened. But it's like certain figures want to reinscribe things that were already in pop culture. They want to make a new place in pop culture for them by their own hand. And I find that a little bit devious. And, you've got Dave Grohl and Foo Fighters out there doing a song like Tom Sawyer, being, again, in my view, pimping songs out to sort of increase their populist appeal. Like, I'm sorry, I never looked at Rush as like a populist band. Yes, they have hits like Tom Sawyer and Limelight and Working Man that are well known, that you might, hear out at a bar or something. If they still have a jukebox there, now you can pick almost any song at a bar that you want. But you might get that sort of everyday kind of recognition for stuff like that. But why are you using this band as a springboard for that? Because you are a populist, right? I'm sorry, Rush fans, if we're going to go down this road of like, we have certain traits in common because we're fan bases of these bands. Well, these are people who tend to sit with records and go record by record by record by record and go deep into the music. So what the fuck do we need you to re-dangle this thing that we love back at us for? I don't dig that at all. I think it's really smarmy and disingenuous, and it cheapens music that I love and makes me angry. Now, in the Dio documentary, there's a sequence where Jack Black talks about in the Tenacious D comedy, Dio actually makes an appearance and wrote a song, which I think was really well done. I mean, he wrote, he's winking at himself, which if you're winking at yourself, cool, but you get into a real shady area with me when you, the comedian, can't stop the comedy and can't just shut that off and go, look, I can't tell you how much this music meant to me. This was so huge for me. And so I wanted to make him a character in my film, but also kind of funny like us. I would have totally gotten behind that. But I don't need it in this context. I don't need these cliches that this film tries to present. Heavy metal is now totally embedded in culture. It is not the refuge of the broken toys and the misfits and the people who have nowhere else to go. It never should have been that to begin with. It never should have been a social organizing vehicle. It should completely have just been about music, not, I want to get the like darkest, evilest shit around, and I want to wear a t-shirt to provoke people, and I live in a town where, it's mostly Christian conservatives and it's going to piss everybody off, so I want to hang out with the kids who do that because we're sort of on the edge. Okay, I get that. There's some people that have had that experience, but for me, it's all about the music and nothing else. I have met many, many people who I'm friends with because we love metal. I'm not saying that I'm not friends with people because we love metal, but those are three-dimensional people to me. You would not look at them and be able to necessarily tell that they love metal unless they happen to be wearing a t-shirt, right? We need to move past this junior high school inclination to mark ourselves in a way that everyone can tell what our interests are because we need to broadcast to the world what our interests are. Get the fuck out of here with that. And I don't want a film selling me that lie because it's a lie. If you love Dio, watch this film. You're still going to love the film. You're going to love the interviews. But you don't need to be sold on something that is completely flimsy, was always flimsy to begin with. And even if it did hold water at all, is completely like passé. It's tired. We don't need to go there. Again, though, can't recommend the autobiography enough, which I'll hold up one more time. Can't recommend this enough. You can see Chili Public Library. That doesn't say Chili, even though to you that says Chili, but where I live, the town is pronounced Chili. Chili Public Library. Dio is imploring me to return this book on time so that I can avoid getting library fees. I also would recommend with, I guess it's more up to how deep you're willing to dive with this album? Do you need the 4 CD set? Can you be okay with one of the reissues? Should you go look for it in your favorite thrift store or order it from Discogs, an original pressing on vinyl? It's up to you. Booklet is nice. Details are nice. I'm glad I have it, but that's entirely up to you. You will have your preference as to which mix you prefer. And the burning question, am I going to get my daughter a poster of that? And if I do, how long will it last? Because I asked her, I said, are you sure you want that? I mean, she's like, yeah. I love it. It's not going to scare you? No. So we'll see. She's 5. I mean, I can always just put the poster up in my house. Obviously, my walls are in need of artwork. I don't have the Sabby man-child cave set up yet with all my books and CDs, which are in boxes. I'm having, shelves, like getting my shelves together and getting everything together and where the book's going to go and, where's the music going to go, all that stuff. So shout out to Rhino. Shout out to everybody involved in all these projects. It's easy for me to sit here and criticize filmmakers, or the Banger team that did the Rush documentary, which I'm not sure if I mentioned, but I have them in mind as well because they also went down that same path of Rush fans are all, a certain type of person and blah, 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 and they relate to each other and whatever. But, at the end of the day, those people are getting this work done, and those of us sitting here talking about it, we need to remember that that's what we're doing. So, whatever I feel about a film in reception of it, I always recognize the immense amount of work that goes into it. And I always try to point out the positive and just tip my hat in respect for people to follow through and get these things done with the sanctioning of the people in those bands or in their estate. I should also mention that Dreamers Never Die features Vinny Appice, Mick Wall, Wendy Dio, of course, Craig Goldie, who played an important part in Ronnie James Dio's music and life. Who else? We have Sebastian Bach. We have Eddie Trunk. There's someone I'm skipping. There's Dan Lilker from Nuclear Assault / Brutal Truth / Anthrax / SOD. And there's someone else besides Jack Black that Rob Halford. And there might be someone else I'm forgetting, unfortunately. But all those people are in there. The interviews look fantastic. They are insightful. I love what Halford has to say as a contemporary of Dio's. Glenn Hughes and Roger Glover are also in it. Former Deep Purple guys. So there you have it. For Feedback Def, I'm Sabby Reyes Kulkarni, the Apostate Music Journalist. Thanks for watching. Over and out.